The Shadows of Pinebrook, Uncovering a Web of Revenge, a crime mystery thriller. In the heart of a secluded town, Detective Miles Carter is drawn into a chilling web of murder and revenge. When a series of brutal killings shakes Pinebrook, Miles must navigate through a maze of secrets and deceit to uncover the truth. With each revelation, the shadows of the past grow darker and the stakes higher. Brace yourself for a gripping crime thriller where every clue leads deeper into a world of vengeance and buried sins. The road into Pinebrook twisted like a snake through the dense forest, and Detective Miles Ward could feel the weight of the town's secrets pressing against him even before he saw the first rooftop peek through the trees. Pinebrook wasn't large, just a collection of old colonial houses clustered around a small downtown, surrounded by farms and forest. It was the kind of place where people knew each other's names and believed in keeping their business private. But something had changed in Pinebrook, something dark and dangerous that brought him here. Miles leaned back in the worn leather seat of his sedan and watched as the town came into view. The streets were lined with trees, their branches casting long shadows across the road. The late afternoon sun painted everything in a deep orange hue, giving the town an almost picturesque quality. But Miles knew better. Beneath that quiet facade, something deadly lurked. He pulled up to the police station, a squat brick building that looked as tired as the officers who worked inside. As he stepped out of the car, the scent of pine filled his lungs, a sharp contrast to the smell of the city he had left behind. He straightened his coat, adjusted his hat, and walked inside, feeling the eyes of the locals on him as he went. Inside the station, Chief Mark Stanton waited. He was a burly man with a face that spoke of too many sleepless nights and too many unsolved cases. He extended a hand, his grip firm but weary. "Ward, thanks for coming." Miles nodded. "You've got a tough one on your hands, Chief." Stanton sighed. "Tough is putting it lightly. Victor Grimshaw wasn't just anyone in this town. He was, well, let's just say people around here thought he was untouchable. Until now," Miles replied, his voice flat. "Yeah," Stanton said, rubbing the back of his neck. "Until now." They walked through the station, passing officers buried in paperwork and others huddled around white boards covered in photographs and scribbled notes. Miles followed Stanton into a small office where a collection of case files had been neatly stacked on the desk. On the wall hung a photograph of Victor Grimshaw, late 40s, silver-haired, with sharp eyes and a smile that didn't reach them. He looked every bit the businessman Miles expected, exuding power and control. "He was found in his mansion 3 days ago," Stanton began. "Shot twice, once in the chest, once in the head. No signs of forced entry. No witnesses. The place was locked up tight." Miles raised an eyebrow. "No forced entry?" "Nope. Front door was locked when we got there. His wife found him, Catherine Grimshaw. She's the one who called it in." Miles tapped his chin thoughtfully. "And no leads?" Stanton shook his head. "Nothing solid. We've interviewed the wife, the staff, his business partners. Everyone seems shocked, but no one has anything useful to offer. It's like the guy just got murdered out of thin air." "And the town?" Miles asked. "The town's on edge," Stanton said, his voice dropping. "Grimshaw was a big deal here, funded a lot of local projects, had his hand in almost every business. People are nervous. If someone like Grimshaw can be killed, then no one's safe." Miles picked up a file and flipped through it, glancing over the autopsy report. "You said something in your message about other unsolved cases." Stanton nodded, a grim look on his face. "We've had 2 other murders in the past 6 months. Both powerful men in town, Thomas Carter, a real estate developer, and Richard Vance, who owned most of the farmland on the outskirts. Both were killed in similar ways. No forced entry, no witnesses, no clear motive. We tried connecting the dots, but nothing's come up." Miles leaned back in his chair, considering the information. 3 wealthy men, all pillars of the community, all killed in ways that suggested the killer was careful, methodical. The lack of forced entry pointed to one of 2 things. Either the killer knew the victims, or they had a way of getting in without being seen. What about enemies? Miles asked. Did Grimshaw have any? Stanton let out a bitter laugh. Grimshaw? Plenty. But not the kind you'd expect. He was a shrewd businessman. Some say ruthless. He made a lot of money and not everyone liked how he did it. There are rumors, blackmail, threats, deals gone sour. But no one's ever come forward with anything concrete. It's like he had some kind of hold over the people in this town. Miles set the file down and stood. I'll start by talking to his wife. Then I'll want to see the crime scene. Catherine Grimshaw's at the mansion. I'll drive you there. The ride to the Grimshaw mansion was quiet, the streets growing narrower as they left the center of town. The mansion stood on a hill, overlooking Pinebrook like a silent sentinel. It was an old, sprawling estate with ivy crawling up the stone walls and a wrought iron gate that creaked as it opened. Catherine Grimshaw was waiting for them at the door. She was a striking woman in her late 30s, with dark hair pulled back into a tight bun and eyes red from crying. She wore a black dress that clung to her slender frame, and her hands trembled as she welcomed them inside. Detective Ward, she said softly, her voice hollow. Thank you for coming. Miles gave her a nod. I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Grimshaw. I just need to ask you a few questions. She led them into the sitting room, a grand space filled with expensive furniture and paintings that likely cost more than Miles earned in a year. Catherine sat down on a velvet sofa, clasping her hands in her lap as Miles took a seat across from her. Mrs. Grimshaw, he began, can you tell me about the night your husband was killed? Catherine took a deep breath, her gaze fixed on the floor. I wasn't home when it happened. I had gone to visit my sister in the next town over. When I came back, Victor was already. Her voice cracked and she covered her mouth with her hand, tears welling in her eyes. Miles waited for her to compose herself before speaking again. Did your husband have any enemies? Anyone who might have wanted to hurt him? Catherine hesitated for a moment before shaking her head. Victor was a difficult man, but he wasn't cruel. He had business rivals, sure, but nothing that would lead to this. At least, not that I know of. What about his business dealings? Miles pressed. Were there any deals he was involved in that could have gone bad? Catherine's eyes flickered with something. Fear, perhaps. Victor didn't talk much about his work. He kept it separate from our life here. But I know he was dealing with some questionable people. I warned him, but he wouldn't listen. He always thought he was untouchable. Questionable how? Miles asked. She shook her head. I don't know. He never gave me details. But I had a feeling he was in over his head. There was something different about him in the weeks leading up to his death. He was more secretive, more paranoid. Miles nodded, taking mental notes. Something about Grimshaw's life had shifted recently, and it had made him a target. I'd like to see the room where it happened, Miles said. Catherine stood and led them up a grand staircase, the wooden steps creaking under their weight. They walked down a long hallway lined with portraits of Grimshaw's ancestors, their eyes watching them as they passed. Finally, they reached the master bedroom. The room was large and opulent, with a four-poster bed, heavy curtains, and antique furniture. But all Miles could focus on was the blood stain on the carpet near the window, the spot where Victor Grimshaw had taken his last breath. Miles walked over to the window, looking out at the sprawling grounds below. The view was serene, but the tension in the room was palpable. Did your husband have any visitors that day? Miles asked. Catherine shook her head. Not that I know of. He spent most of his time in his study or in meetings. But he always made sure the staff knew when someone was coming over. Miles glanced at Stanton, who had been silent during the exchange. The chief met his gaze and nodded slightly, understanding what the detective was thinking. There was more to Victor Grimshaw's life than what his wife knew, or was willing to share. Miles stepped away from the window, his mind racing with possibilities. There was a pattern here, a connection between the murders of Grimshaw and the other men in town. He just needed to find it. And as he looked around the room one last time, He knew that the shadows of Pinebrook were deeper than they seemed. Miles left the mansion with more questions than answers. Catherine Grimshaw's evasive demeanor gnawed at him. There was something she wasn't telling him. As they drove back toward town, Stanton was quiet, his eyes fixed on the road ahead, the thickening dusk casting long shadows on the pavement. "So, what's your take on the wife?" Stanton finally asked, breaking the silence. Miles tapped his fingers against his knee, deep in thought. "She's holding something back. She may not have pulled the trigger, but she knows more than she's letting on." Stanton nodded. "You think she's protecting someone?" "Maybe," Miles replied. "Or maybe she's afraid." Grimshaw wasn't just a businessman, he was involved in something else. "I can feel it." As they reached the police station, Miles' mind was already working on the next steps. He needed to dig deeper into Victor Grimshaw's past and his connections. Something told him the answers weren't in the usual suspects but in the shadows of Pinebrook's history. The next morning, Miles returned to the station early. He spread out the files on the desk in front of him, his eyes scanning the details of the other two murders. Thomas Carter, the real estate developer, had been killed in his office after hours. Like Grimshaw, there had been no forced entry and no witnesses. Richard Vance, the wealthy landowner, had been found dead in his barn, the only evidence a few muddy footprints leading away into the woods. There was something tying these men together, something beyond their wealth and power. Stanton knocked on the door, entering the office with a fresh cup of coffee. "You find anything?" Miles gestured to the files. "There's a connection between them, but it's not immediately obvious. All three men were powerful, yes, but they were also tied to something else, something that goes back years." Stanton frowned. "What do you mean?" "I looked into the factory you mentioned. The old defunct one on the outskirts of town. Turns out all three men were investors in that factory back in the day. It was supposed to be a huge moneymaker, but it closed down after a series of accidents. Some workers died and the place was shut down. No one talks about it anymore, but I think it's the key." Stanton crossed his arms. "You think these murders are tied to something that happened at that factory?" Miles nodded. "I think someone's out for revenge." Miles decided to visit the factory himself. It sat just beyond the edge of town, a looming structure that had been left to decay over the years. The windows were shattered, the walls covered in graffiti, and the once bustling machines inside had long since rusted into oblivion. As he stepped inside, the air was thick with dust and the silence was oppressive. He walked through the main floor, his footsteps echoing off the concrete walls. The factory had the eerie stillness of a place that had been forgotten, but the energy in the air told him otherwise. Something had happened here, something terrible. Miles moved deeper into the factory, his flashlight cutting through the dim light. He came across old filing cabinets, their contents long discarded, and an office that had been trashed, papers scattered everywhere. But there, on the floor, half hidden beneath the debris, was something that caught his eye, a piece of old parchment yellowed with age. He bent down and picked it up, carefully unfolding it. It was a contract dated nearly 2 decades ago, with names that he recognized: Victor Grimshaw, Thomas Carter, and Richard Vance. They had signed it, along with several other names, but one stood out: the name of the factory's manager, a man named Jacob Harlan. "Harlan?" Miles whispered to himself. He flipped the paper over and saw a crude drawing of a symbol, a circle with a slash through it. It was the same symbol he had seen on some of Victor's belongings. The collective. Miles felt a chill run down his spine. This wasn't just about business gone bad. This was about something much darker, something hidden beneath Pinebrook for decades. As Miles turned to leave, he heard a faint noise behind him, a creak like the shifting of weight on old floorboards. His instincts kicked in and he whipped around, flashlight raised. But there was no one there. The factory was empty. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Back at the station, Miles filled Stanton in on his findings. Jacob Harlan disappeared around the same time the factory closed, Miles said. There were rumors that he was involved in the accidents that led to the deaths of the workers, but nothing was ever proven. After the factory shut down, Harlan vanished and no one's heard from him since. You think he's still alive? Stanton asked. Miles nodded. And I think he's the one behind these murders. He's getting revenge on the men who ruined his life. Stanton frowned. But why wait so long? Why now? That's what we need to find out, Miles said. Harlan must have been waiting for something, maybe for the right moment, maybe for all the pieces to fall into place. But I'm willing to bet he's not done yet. Miles spent the next few days digging deeper into Jacob Harlan's past. He scoured old newspapers, talked to locals who remembered the factory, and pieced together a portrait of a man who had once been a respected figure in Pinebrook but had fallen into disgrace after the factory's closure. But Harlan wasn't just a disgruntled former manager. He had been part of something larger. The collective, as it turned out, was a secret society that operated within the town's elite. They had formed years ago, using the factory as a front for their illegal dealings. When the factory closed, so did their operations. But Harlan had been left out to dry, abandoned by the men he had once trusted. Now, years later, he was seeking his revenge. Miles tracked down an old colleague of Harlan's, a retired factory worker named Bill Harding, who lived in a small house on the outskirts of town. Bill was reluctant to talk at first, but Miles' persistence wore him down. Harlan wasn't a bad man, Bill said, his voice raspy from years of smoking. But he got caught up in something he couldn't control. Those men, Grimshaw, Carter, Vance, they used him. Made him the scapegoat when things went south. He lost everything because of them. Do you think he's the one behind the murders? Miles asked. Bill looked down at his hands, his face lined with regret. I wouldn't be surprised. Harlan was a broken man after the factory closed. I heard he went underground, living off the grid. If he's still out there, he's got nothing to lose. Miles left Bill's house with a heavy heart. Harlan had been wronged, but that didn't justify murder. Still, Miles understood the desperation that could drive a man to the edge. Late that night, as Miles sat in his motel room, going over his notes, his phone buzzed. It was Stanton. We've got another body, Stanton said, his voice tense. It's Catherine Grimshaw. Miles felt a jolt of shock. I'm on my way. He arrived at the Grimshaw mansion to find the place swarming with police. Catherine's body had been found in the garden, her neck snapped. There were no signs of struggle, no forced entry once again. Stanton met him at the scene, his face grim. It's just like the others, Miles. No evidence, no witnesses. The killer's getting bolder. Miles crouched down next to Catherine's body, his mind racing. Why had she been targeted now? She hadn't been involved in the factory, at least not that he knew of. But then something clicked. Catherine was about to talk, Miles said, standing up. She knew something about her husband's dealings with Harlan, something that would have exposed him. Stanton frowned. But why kill her? To keep her quiet, Miles replied. Harlan isn't just after revenge, he's trying to cover his tracks. He knows we're getting closer and he's panicking. The next morning, Miles received an anonymous tip. A handwritten note slipped under his motel room door. It read, "Meet me at the old factory tonight. Alone. The truth awaits." Miles knew it was a trap, but he had no choice. Harlan was playing a game, and Miles needed to confront him if he was ever going to end this. That night, Miles returned to the factory, the air thick with tension. He moved through the darkened halls, his hand resting on the handle of his gun. The building creaked and groaned around him, the shadows shifting as if they had a life of their own. At the center of the factory, in the old manager's office, Miles found him. Jacob Harlan was older now, his once strong frame hunched with age, his face lined with years of bitterness. He sat behind the desk, a revolver resting on the table in front of him, his eyes cold and distant. "I knew you'd come," Harlan said, his voice hoarse. Miles didn't move. "You've killed enough, Harlan. It's over." Harlan shook his head slowly. "It's never over. Not until they all pay." "They're dead, Harlan," Miles said. "Grimshaw, Carter, Vance, they're gone. Catherine's gone. You had your revenge." Harlan's eyes flickered with something. Regret, perhaps, or maybe just exhaustion. "It wasn't supposed to be like this. We were supposed to build something great. But they destroyed everything." Miles took a step forward. "You can stop this now. It doesn't have to end with more blood." Harlan looked down at the revolver, his fingers trembling. For a moment, Miles thought he might reach for it, but then, slowly, Harlan pushed it away. "I'm tired," Harlan said quietly. "So tired." Miles moved closer, carefully taking the gun from the table. "It's over, Harlan." The old man nodded, slumping back in his chair. "It's over." In the days that followed, Pinebrook began to heal. The murders had shocked the town, but with Harlan's arrest, there was a sense of closure. Miles had uncovered the dark secrets that had haunted the town for decades, but the truth, as always, came at a cost. As he prepared to leave Pinebrook, Miles stood at the edge of town, looking out over the quiet streets. The shadows were still there, lingering in the corners of the town's history, but for now they were at rest. Miles got into his car and drove away, the weight of the case still heavy on his shoulders. There would be more cases, more towns with secrets to uncover, but for now he was content to leave Pinebrook behind. The shadows would always be there, but Miles knew he was ready for whatever came next. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to like the video, share it with others, and subscribe for more thrilling tales. Explore our playlist of crime mysteries for more gripping stories. See you in the next story.